Every crime begins with a decision. Sometimes that decision is calculated, sometimes emotional, sometimes made in a split second with no conscious reflection. But whether deliberate or impulsive, the decision creates a chain of actions that shapes everything that follows. And in criminal profiling, it is this chain, the logic of behavior, that matters most. A crime scene is not just a place where something happened. It is a place where someone acted. Someone made choices, rejected other possibilities, adapted to obstacles, and responded to fear, opportunity, and time pressure. When we analyze a crime, we are not simply gathering facts. We are reconstructing a sequence of decisions, and each decision can reveal something about the offender's mindset, capabilities, limitations, and priorities. Real profiling has nothing to do with intuition or inspired guesswork. It is not about sensing who the offender might be or building dramatic psychological portraits. It is a method grounded in evidence, behavioral evidence. The way the offender approached the scene, initiated contact, handled resistance, adjusted when events shifted, and exited. Each of these choices forms a pattern that can be described, tested, and studied. Profiling is not designed to identify a specific person. It identifies a way of operating. In professional practice, a profile does not aim to produce a neat demographic label. Instead, it clarifies behavioral features that matter operationally. For example, the offender shows high tolerance for risk, demonstrates situational confidence early in the event, and shifts toward impulsive decision-making when unexpected resistance occurs. These are behavioral qualities, not personal details. They help investigators focus their efforts without falling into the trap of speculation. Before a profiler can interpret anything, they must understand what profiling is not. It is not mind reading. It is not deduction from thin air. It is not a psychological diagnosis. And it is not a shortcut. Profiling never replaces investigative work. It supports it. It can help narrow lines of inquiry, clarify plausible behavioral types, and highlight what deserves attention. But it cannot substitute for physical evidence, interviews, or operational analysis. The core of profiling is the ability to see the crime as a process rather than a static event. Consider a simple question: why this location? There are countless possibilities: convenience, emotional significance, familiarity, low visibility, high visibility, opportunity, or pure chance. But the profiler is not asking what is theoretically possible. The profiler is asking, given the sequence of actions we can observe, which explanation is consistent with the behavior that actually occurred? The same logic applies to timing. Why this day? Why this hour? Why this moment? Was the offender following a routine, acting on impulse, waiting for a specific condition? Each decision narrows the field of realistic interpretations. By analyzing choice after choice, the profiler begins to understand the offender's operational world, how the offender thinks, moves, and manages risk in real conditions. Behavior can appear chaotic, but even chaotic behavior has structure. Offenders with low self-control show recognizable patterns. Offenders who plan extensively show different patterns. Emotional escalation has its own rhythm. Fear, anger, confidence, hesitation, each produces distinct behavioral signatures. The profiler's task is not to guess what the offender felt. The task is to identify how internal states translated into observable actions. To do this, the profiler relies on data. Hard data describes the external skeleton of the crime: the location, the entry, the sequence of movements, the physical interactions, the tools used, the spatial choices, and the exit. Soft data describes the internal dynamics as they appear in behavior, how the offender coped with obstacles, whether they escalated or de-escalated, whether they improvised or followed a structure, whether they acted with control or panic. Both categories must be combined before any interpretation becomes meaningful. A single detail in isolation proves nothing, but patterns across details, consistent risk-taking, consistent control, consistent avoidance, consistent adaptation begin to reveal the underlying behavioral logic. One of the most advanced skills in profiling is not only identifying what happened, but noticing what could have happened and did not. An offender who leaves a chaotic scene may seem careless, but the absence of certain actions can still be meaningful. If the offender had time and opportunity to reduce evidence and chose not to. An offender who avoids unnecessary violence reflects a different behavioral orientation than one who escalates rapidly. Absence can be as revealing as presence, but it must be interpreted with discipline, because absence can also result from inexperience, emotion, time pressure, opportunity, or sheer coincidence. A profiler must continually guard against confirmation bias. The moment the analysis bends to fit a preferred narrative, the entire process collapses. Every hypothesis must have alternatives. Every interpretation must be tested against the rest of the evidence. If it fails that test, it is discarded. Profiling is less about dramatic insight and more about disciplined thinking under uncertainty. This leads to a fundamental perspective. A crime is not a random eruption of behavior. It is a sequence of choices shaped by internal and external pressures. If we understand the sequence, we understand the offender's decision-making. And if we understand decision-making, we can begin to understand the kind of operator who would act this way. Not who they are, but how they function. That shift from what happened to how it unfolded is the foundation of behavioral analysis. And it prepares us for the next step, examining the behavioral timeline of an offense, from the decisions leading up to it, through the actions during the event, to the adjustments and reactions afterward. When we follow the offender's decisions closely enough, something important becomes clear. Behavior doesn't simply happen. It evolves. It shifts in response to pressure, opportunity, miscalculations, and emotion. No offender maintains the same level of composure throughout an entire crime. Even highly organized individuals reveal moments of instability, hesitation, or loss of control. And for a profiler, those moments are often the most revealing. Control and loss of control form a pattern. Some offenders start confidently and unravel when confronted with resistance. Others begin uncertain and become more decisive as the event progresses. These shifts expose psychological boundaries, what the offender can handle, what overwhelms them, and how quickly they adapt when reality stops matching expectation. A key insight in behavioral analysis is that offenders rarely behave exactly the way they imagine they will. Reality disrupts fantasy. Pressure disrupts planning. Timing disrupts confidence. When events deviate from the offender's internal script, true capabilities surface. Someone who relies heavily on preparation may panic when confronted with unpredictability. Someone who acts impulsively may freeze when forced into a rapid decision under real consequences. These reactions are not random. They are diagnostic. Much of profiling involves identifying these pressure points. Where did the offender hesitate? Where did they rush? Where did they take a risk they did not need to take? Where did they suddenly change strategy? Every deviation tells a story about tolerance for stress, emotional regulation, experience, and self-control. Qualities that matter far more than demographic assumptions. They define the behavioral type investigators should consider. Equally important are the constraints the offender faced. No offender has unlimited time, unlimited knowledge, or unlimited emotional stability. Every crime is shaped by limitations: unfamiliar space, the possibility of interruption, fear of discovery, the victim's behavior, or the offender's own physical and psychological boundaries. Understanding these constraints helps reconstruct the internal logic of the event. It clarifies why certain decisions were made and why other possibilities were avoided. Behavior is rarely purely strategic. Even calculated offenders show moments where emotion leaks into action. Anger sharpens or destabilizes. Fear accelerates decisions. Excitement narrows focus. Tension amplifies mistakes. A profiler does not try to read emotions directly. Instead, the profiler observes how pressure and emotion become visible through choices. The clearer the link between pressure and behavior, the clearer the interpretation becomes. One of the most powerful analytical tools is comparing what the offender did with what the offender could have done. If they left quickly, they may have felt pressed. If they lingered, they may have felt in control. If they changed method mid-crime, something disrupted their internal or external conditions. If they repeated a specific action, that repetition may reveal habit, comfort, competence, or an emotional need connected to the offense. Every option rejected can be as meaningful as the option chosen. This discipline is what prevents profiling from collapsing into storytelling. There is always a temptation to create narratives that feel right, especially in emotionally intense cases. But real profiling requires stepping back from intuition and returning to evidence. Every interpretation must be anchored in behavior that can be observed, described, and logically connected to decision-making. If the data does not support a conclusion, the conclusion does not stand. As the analysis deepens, the crime begins to look less like a chaotic event and more like a behavioral progression. The profiler begins to see not only what happened, but how the offender thinks under pressure. This becomes invaluable when investigators narrow their search, assess suspects, or evaluate the likelihood of future offending. What emerges is not a traditional psychological portrait. It is a behavioral framework, an evidence-based interpretation of how the offender interacts with opportunity, risk, control, emotion, and environment. This framework guides investigative focus. It points to what is relevant, what is unlikely, and what interpretations fit both the data and the underlying logic of the crime. This lesson lays the groundwork for everything that comes next. To move deeper into profiling, we must move from theory into structure, from general behavioral principles into the concrete timeline of an offense. Every crime unfolds in 3 phases: what happens before it, what happens during it, and what happens after. Each phase exposes different aspects of the offender's psychology. Preparation reveals intention and planning style. The event reveals stress response, emotional control, and real-time decision-making. The aftermath reveals how the offender stabilizes, hides, rationalizes, or prepares for the possibility of future actions. In the next lesson, we will examine these 3 phases closely. We will break the behavioral sequence into its essential components, show how each stage reflects a different facet of the offender's thinking, and demonstrate why understanding this timeline is one of the most powerful tools in investigative profiling.